Gospel of Luke, and as you listen, I think you'll hear some echoes from the passage that the keepers read just a few moments ago. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up to the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. Thanks be to God. I thought with Swing Dixie here, and it being this hinge week between Epiphany and Lent, that I would have a really light, fun sermon this morning. But the news got in the way. This isn't light, and it's not particularly fun. The title of my sermon is Bread, Juice, Staple. Let us pray. Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you. Amen. So I do have a news flash for you. The church is fallible. Institutions are fallible. Every church and every institution I know of is made up of fallible human beings. And somewhere deep down inside, we all know that, we get it, but we often expect otherwise. And so when we are confronted with fallibility in the church, when we are confronted with behaviors that don't seem to magnify the love of God, that constrict rather than expand the circle of God's love, it is all the more painful, I think, because we come with high expectations for the church. I think the pain we experience with the institutional church can be more painful than pain we experience elsewhere, largely because of the heavy expectations we have. It has been a painful week for many in the institutional church. The United Methodist Church, one of the largest Christian denominations in our country, for 3 years they have been doing this big push to make their denomination more affirming of the LGBTQ community. And so this week they called a special 3-day meeting to essentially vote. It was called just for this purpose. They wanted to change their book of discipline and make it more welcoming to the LGBT community. And I thought, finally, right? This is a decades-old conflict. And usually you don't call for a vote unless you know it's going to pass, right? The motion that would allow for this more expansive circle of love was blocked. And instead, the denomination voted on what was called the traditional plan, which affirms their book of discipline, insisting that LGBTQ people cannot be pastors, nor can they be married in their congregations. Now, there are many churches, many United Methodist churches, in this decades-old conflict. They're called reconciling churches that reconciling is United Methodist lingo for open and affirming for us. It would mean the same thing. They've essentially been ignoring the book of discipline for years. And so this vote and how it will be lived out is not only deeply painful for many, but also poses a threat for their continued existence. These days, there are many people who don't pay that much attention to denominations. And I know that there are many of us who have come from different traditions, and we may at some point have been a Presbyterian or a Methodist or a Lutheran or Episcopalian or a Catholic, and it just didn't fit it right anymore, so we went church shopping. And you go church shopping until you find a church that feels like it can be your spiritual home. There are lots of people with that experience. There are some people, however, whose denominational loyalty is as much part of the fabric of their being as their family of origin or their cultural heritage. And so, what are these people for whom their connection to their denomination is so strong? What are they supposed to do with news like this? Do they stay put and try to change the system from within? Do they decide they've had enough and divorce themselves from the denomination and look for another church? Do they throw their hands up and give up on church altogether? Any of those responses could be understandable, right? And I would not presume to know the right answer for any one person. But this morning, I want to make a case for sticking with the church with a capital C, as fallible as it is. Now, in the United Church of Christ, we often say that God is still speaking, meaning that we expect that revelation, growth, and our understanding of who God is and how we're to act in the world is always evolving. Throughout history and throughout Scripture, we see constant evolution. But it's not always linear. There are steps forward and steps backward. Forward and back. Back, back, and forward. We see some of that evolution in our strange texts for this morning. In the first reading from Exodus, Moses has had an encounter with God and comes down the mountain with a new book of discipline. It was etched into 2 tablets. We've come to call them the 10 Commandments. These came after 611 other laws had been cited in the Hebrew Bible. Some crazy laws, like, for example, don't plant more than one kind of seed in a field. Don't cook a goat in its mother's milk. Don't eat owls. Don't wear clothes made of both linen and wool. We could find scriptural citations for each of those laws. Thank goodness for some growth. Yet earlier in this same chapter of Exodus, the author, who, make no mistake, the author of Exodus and every other book of the Bible was a fallible human being, trying to capture what he, and we know most certainly that it was a he, what he understood of God. This author has God saying that God will drive out a whole list of people, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, and on and on. And then God cautions Moses to not make treaties with any of those people. I don't think that passage shows up in our signed lectionaries. But it reflects that here in Exodus, we have a God who is expanding and contracting, moving forwards and backwards, trying to break down the 600 rules to make the book of discipline a little more accessible, but still holding firm to who is in and who is out. So jump ahead with me to the Gospel of Luke. Jesus appears on the mountain with Moses and Elijah. Clearly, this is a literary move to demonstrate the connection of Jesus to Moses and to Elijah. It's a literary move to connect Jesus to to everything that has happened before, to give credibility to Jesus' authority and power. And thank God there had been some evolution since the time Moses had come down the mountain etching things in stone. Jesus brought the new covenant. He boiled down the 10 Commandments to just 2. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. It sounds simple, doesn't it? But we are still trying to figure it out. We in the UCC like to boast about a whole bunch of firsts. We were the first denomination to ordain an African American pastor in 1785, but we very clearly still struggle with racism. We were the first denomination to ordain a woman in 1853, but there are still congregations in our denomination who are not at all comfortable calling a woman to serve. We ordained the first openly gay pastor in 1972, and we were the first denomination to pass a marriage equality resolution in 2005. But only 20% of United Church of Christ churches claim to be open and affirming. And many of you will remember the pain and tension that occurred here in this congregation as you tried to sort out your position on marriage equality. It was a painful time. And I'm glad you had that discussion before I got here. Expanding and contracting. Moving forward and backward. Backwards and forward. The process of learning and growing and evolving is difficult and painful and a rocky, rocky road. There were many of us this week who were hoping that this week might have been a mountaintop experience for the United Methodist Church, and thereby be a mountaintop experience for all of us. My hunch is that even for those who won the vote, while they may have experienced some relief, I am pretty sure that they didn't feel as though those moments were filled with a luminous spirit and a moment that they wanted to just hold in time and make tents and stay there and not go home. I am quite sure that is not how it felt. Most of my life, I have read this transfiguration story, this mountaintop story, as a feel-good moment, right? I gravitate to the details of the dazzling clothes, to the glory, to Peter saying, "It is so good to be here," and how he wants everybody to stay all together. I just seem to skip over verse 31. Did you catch this? Here's verse 31. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Did you catch that? Jesus is talking about his death. That couldn't have been very fun. This story is about those moments when things come into focus for us. Who we are, whose we are, who our teachers are, and then how we're going to live life after those moments. Last Sunday, we heard from Laura and some other Rock Springers about their experience on the border. Their experience was marked with profound grief and new insight about what is happening in our country. Their experience clearly has shaped their understanding and will surely affect their actions and hopefully eventually ours as well. The meeting of the United Methodist Church was likely clarifying for some people and confusing for others. My friend and colleague, the Reverend David Meredith, he is an openly gay pastor in Ohio, told someone in the press on Wednesday. He said, our work is to live like that book of discipline no longer exists and to be the church. This from someone who has faced denominational discipline hearings since he married his longtime partner in 2016. He continued and said, let's not step back from challenging, resisting everything, ignoring the books, so that we can simply be beloved children of God and the beloved people of God. Now, every individual and every congregation will need to decide for themselves how they will respond to the events of this week. And it will surely be a rocky road forward. If we keep reading on in Luke, just a mere 4 verses right after the passage I read, we learn that while Peter, James, and John were up on the mountain, the other 9 disciples were on the ground. And they were approached by a father who needed help for his son, and they didn't do a thing. Listen to these verses. It says, this is right after what I read before. On the next day, when they had just come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly, a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. And Jesus answered, turning to his disciples, and said, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." And while he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. Forwards and backwards. Backwards and backwards and forward. Glorious moments and hard work on the ground. Life is all of this. It's not one or the other. It is all of this, and we are constantly presented with the tensions of that reality. Life is all of this. And amidst all of this, transformation happens. Something new is always being born. We don't know yet what will be born from this event with the United Methodists. We don't know yet what will next be born at Rock Spring. But I will not give up on the church with a capital C, fallible as it is, because it is through the church. It is through the church that I know the power of community and the experience of grace most palpably. And I could recite countless experiences of this. Time allows me just one. Just after the 2016 mass shooting at Pulse, a gay nightclub in Florida, you may remember just a few days after that, we held a service of hope and healing in this sanctuary. We sent a couple emails, invited area churches, and 13 different churches brought people to this service. Each brought a gift with them, a song to sing, a prayer, scripture. Our windows held colorful construction paper chains, and in the center there was a candle wrapped with rainbow-colored ribbon. It was an evening 3 or 4 days after that tragedy. It was an evening when God's love and grace were palpable in this space. It was an evening when we knew for sure that love is stronger than death, that we have more in common with our sisters and brothers than we have differences, and that we are called again and again to bear witness to an ever-expanding circle of love. And today we must bear witness again. Forward and back, glorious moments and hard work on the ground, and always the possibility of transformation. Today we're going to gather around the largest table in the world and do the three-step at communion. Bread, juice, staple. We are going to create a rainbow-colored prayer chain and send it to a nearby reconciling United Methodist church to share our solidarity, love, and support with them. It is a modest gesture and a visceral sign that we are all connected whether we know it or not. We will always be confronted with fallibility in the church because people are the church. And when we are confronted with behaviors that don't magnify the love of God, we need to hold one another accountable, and we must be the hands and feet and heart of God to stand up for those who cannot. But more than that, we must make sure that oppressed people feel the love of God through our own individual and collective efforts. Forward and back. Glorious moments and hard work on the ground. Let all we do be done in love. We are all connected in the glorious moments and in the hard work on the ground and in our ever-growing, ever-expanding circle of love. Amen.